I remember the first breath of that morning by the way the espresso steam curled and disappeared into the gray light above my desk. The city wore rain like a shawl, and the panes along the 32nd floor carried thin rivers that chased themselves to the ledge. The building hummed as if the elevator cables had their own heartbeat. Monitors glowed with their cool blue insistence, and my hands, which had learned to move plans and budgets and schedules through rooms of people, wrapped themselves around my mug and held on a little too long. I stood near the window, watching the skyline dissolve and reform, and tried to be grateful for the smallness of my office, the familiar clutter of samples, slabs of stone, fan decks of paint, a model with one wing missing. In that private weather of fluorescent buzz and the soft scratch of paper, I could pretend my life was tidy, even though it had shifted under me in slow, relentless inches. A year earlier, I had signed my name at the bottom of 30 years in a lawyer's office that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and old carpet. The finality surprised me less than the quiet afterward. I had spent most of my adult life translating need into design reviews, managing egos and deadlines, then translating home into lists. Groceries, birthdays, patch that corner of the porch. I had grown a marriage the way I grew projects, patiently with adjustments. But some structures crack from the inside, and you only realize it when your hand comes away chocked with dust. Our children were grown. We were civil, even kind. We just slept in different seasons. The divorce was a map folded back into the glove compartment after a long detour. I told myself I was too old to be reckless. I gave my loneliness a respectable name, independence. On that rainy morning, the email announcing our new senior partner arrived with the tone our internal communications preferred: crisp, neutral, a smile that never showed teeth. He was coming from Boston, it said, with a record of guiding troubled portfolios to stability, of protecting design from the dull blade of budget panic. His name was Philip Arden. A photo accompanied the text, square and polished. Dark suit, a few strands of silver at his temple. An expression that suggested he was both considering you and the building behind you. The office heard the news like a hallway rumor too tidy to be true. We were a firm that built statements, glass and stone, curves that caught light like music. And we had been scolded by the market for dreaming above our balance sheets. Projects had slipped. A hospital expansion had bloomed into litigation. There were whispers about a leak in the Charleston bid, numbers floating to a competitor's desk like feathers under a door. HR sent their earnest reminders about ethics and confidentiality. The rest of us sent each other looks that said, "We do our work, and the currents above us are none of our business." At 9, an assistant told me he'd like a brief tour of our floor. I set down my mug, ran a hand through hair that I kept the same practical length for years, and reminded myself that I had shepherded more CEOs through these glass corridors than any of the interns had birthdays. I could do professional charm with my eyes closed, except that when he stepped out of the elevator, I opened mine and noticed the details that usually slid past me. He was tall, not so much by inches as by the way he carried attention. His tie was simple. His gaze landed and held without pinning. We shook hands. I felt warmth move up my arm like recognition. He asked for the real tour, the things you would show a friend, not a press photographer. He wanted to see the materials library, and the quiet bullpen where a handful of designers worked later than they should, and the small kitchenette no client had ever seen. I watched him take in the unglamorous bones of our mornings and evenings, the bins of rejected samples, the scribbled notes taped to the backs of monitors, the chipped mug that circulated despite attempts to exile it to a cabinet. He smiled once, at the model with the missing wing, and remarked that failure, when named, could be instructive. He said my name when he asked questions, said it as if committing it to memory, as if he intended to use it again in exactly the right place. There was friction in the air, not from anything he did or said, but from the way my body noticed him noticing the work I had spent so long carrying like a stack of breakable plates. I caught myself wanting his respect. It irritated me like realizing I had put mascara on for a budget meeting. We ended the tour in a small conference room with a table that always felt too close to the glass. Rain traced its own agenda down the windows. He looked beyond me to the skyline, then back. He said he'd be assembling a central team to stabilize the Mid-Atlantic portfolio, and if I had the bandwidth, he'd like me to lead the operations side. Contract negotiations, vendor alignments, resource allocation. He had reviewed my record. Steady hands, he said. The words landed like a hand on my back, guiding without pressure. I told him I had bandwidth. Alone later at my desk, I told the espresso machine that I would have created bandwidth if I didn't. Then I stood at the window, watched city lights smear under the rain, and felt something I had promised myself not to feel. The first shiver of wanting to be seen beyond my title. The project that bound us those next weeks was a downtown municipal complex, civic center, public library, a long plaza that would thread between them like a silk ribbon. It was ambitious, politically sensitive, and already attracting the kind of attention that put our name in the paper. The board had exacting donors. The city had a deadline carved in stone by an upcoming election. Our design team believed in the way light could make ordinary lives feel sanctioned. Our accountants believed in the way numbers could keep a firm open. My job was to keep those two faiths from converting each other by force. He scheduled a standing evening check-in at 6:30, after the day's clatter. He called them fireside chats, which would have sounded ridiculous coming from anyone else. We'd meet in a corner conference room that had a view that made the city feel like a living map. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was to translate worry into plan. Overtime battle rhythm, procurement choke points, the board member who only felt courage in a room if he could imagine cutting something. We didn't speak about our lives. We spoke as if our lives were these drawings, these deadlines, and for an hour I felt the relief of being judged only by the smoothness with which I turned static into motion. Office gossip arrived as it always did, wearing perfume that was faintly sweet and stories that were sharper. A young project manager tilted her head when she looked at me, then did not quite manage to tilt it upright before she walked away. Someone made a joke about the 6:30 club. I moved through the comments the way you move through a doorway you've walked 100 times, aware of the frame only when you bump it with your hip. Philip, he had asked me to call him that somewhere in those first few meetings, and I had tried the word in my mouth when I was alone to be sure it belonged. Had a way of paying sustained attention that made silence feel cooperative rather than accusatory. One night, the rain turned to a wind that shivered the windows in their mullions, and the office felt like a ship traveling without passengers. He was reviewing line items on vendor proposals, and I was sorting the personnel grid as if it were a puzzle. He set down his pen and asked how long it had been since I went home before sunset. I gave a half-truth. Long enough. He nodded as if I had told him something true. He said he suspected we had similar calendars. Weekends that trailed work like a shadow. A fridge with a half-remembered lemon in a bowl. He gestured toward the glass, the city, the wind, and said the world was much larger than these floors, and much smaller than what we imagined we owed it. I didn't say that I had been married 30 years, that my default mode was duty, that my body had learned the shape of leaving second. I told him something that felt safer and sounded impressive, that I liked seeing the city change its face from daylight to neon, that it made projects feel like stories with a second act. He smiled without showing teeth. He said it explained why I was good at endings. From there, respect warmed into something that made the air between us denser. When we walked to the boardroom, our steps fell into sequence without coordination. He had a habit of placing his hand lightly at the small of my back when he ushered me through a door, a gesture so subtle it could be dismissed as courtesy. It made my breath mismeasure. I practiced not reacting to it. I failed and let the failure be private. 3 weeks into the project, we left for a 2-day conference in Chicago, where the city's Architectural Guild was hosting a symposium on civic design. We traveled like colleagues gone feral, carry-ons, airport coffee that stung a little, laptops open to PowerPoint decks that learned to perform through repetition. On the plane, we sat in the aisle and window with an empty seat between us, as if we needed a neutral country to reassure us we were not doing anything we wouldn't do in the daylight at home. I watched the clouds step aside for the sun. He read a document slowly, the way people do when they are reading around their own thoughts. At the hotel, the lobby smelled of citrus and new money. Key cards slid into their slots with that obedient green wink. The conference rooms were all glass and optimism. Jazz played somewhere not quite near, the notes like the echo of a laugh. We introduced our firm to strangers as if we were introducing a friend we were proud of. We stood at high tables and described the life of the municipal complex, the plaza's intention to gather without scolding. He watched my words with that patient attention and filled the spaces I left without stepping on my toes. At the end of the first day, the symposium's reception bulged into the hotel bar. Conversation thinned into smaller, more significant confessions. The consultant who admitted he loved libraries more for the chairs than the books, the city planner who confessed a secret fondness for brick because it never forgot it was supporting something. Philip and I found ourselves at a small table near the window, where the city performed itself in lights and the winter rain pressed its cheek against the glass. He told me, in a low voice meant for the small radius of 2 people not pretending to be anything else, that he had lost his wife 6 years earlier. The fact did not ride on a wave of apology or self-pity. It sat between us like an object placed there gently. He said he learned to make soup for one and to sleep on a diagonal. He had a grown son who worked too hard and sent texts like smoke signals. He had tried dating once or twice and disliked the way conversation can become a resume exchanged over wine. I told him about my divorce without ceremony, the long, slow unwinding that felt like gently turning down the volume until the room was silent and still and willing to be left. I told him I had learned to buy single-serving yogurt without feeling observed, and that the quiet was sometimes companionable and sometimes too loud. From there, we didn't say anything brave, but we left nothing dishonest. He looked at me in that way he had, as if he were giving me a few seconds more than anyone else did. My fingertips remembered the shine of the small table. My breath found a new pace. Our elbows brushed. The contact felt like a decision we had not quite made. Then a group of attendees approached with questions and business cards, and the spell folded itself like a napkin. We were professionals again, 2 minds explaining to 3 others how light would fall across a plaza at 4 in the afternoon in October, how a budget was a language you could learn to speak without hating it. When they left, we looked for a way to return to the intimacy we had almost admitted, and didn't find it. Instead, we stood, walked toward the elevators, and pressed the call button without speaking. The elevator hummed its way down and back, and when the doors slid open, we stepped into a small square of polished metal, the sort of space where even strangers sense each other's temperature. The ride to our floor was uneventful, until it wasn't. Between 12 and 14, a gentle shudder moved through the cable, more a sigh than a protest, and we stopped. The light stayed on. The floor numbers declined to advance. There was a moment of collective breath, then the sinister grace of stillness. He pressed the emergency button. A voice responded, calm as a nurse in a storm, promising action and apologizing for inconvenience. The speaker clicked into silence. We were left with the soft growl of our pulses and the knowledge that we had nowhere to go. In the metal reflection, we were tall and a little unreal. I felt the elevator's quiet press at my ribs. He leaned against the back wall, just enough to be casual, and asked if I was all right. I said I preferred rooms I could choose to leave, but that this would do. He smiled, and the smile had an edge I recognized in myself. Discomfort transformed by humor. We stood like that for a minute or two, the space between us the size of a choice. The air felt warmer than it had, or perhaps it was only the proximity of a body I had been trying not to memorize. I became very aware of my sleeve. It seemed like a fragile barrier, like a map that could be folded differently with one touch. He shifted, and his shoulder grazed mine. The thread of that contact unraveled something I had stitched tight. My breath altered. He must have felt it because his eyes moved to my mouth and back to my eyes, quickly, as if he were checking a detail in a plan and did not want to be caught. "Don't," I said softly, not to stop anything but to warn the part of myself that still believed in untouchable rules. He understood perfectly, nodded and did nothing. The restraint felt like a hand curled around mine, firm, warm, a promise of steadiness. The elevator shuddered and began again, a practical, unromantic motion that saved us from ourselves. When the doors slid open, we stepped into the hallway like people who had been given a second chance to remain rational. We said goodnight at my door with warmth that stayed just shy of heat. The next morning's news arrived like thunder after heat lightning. There had been a leak in the municipal complex bid, the kind of leak that sends a rival firm a whisper at the exact right moment. Numbers that should have been sacred appeared in a context they did not belong, and a board member who loved the smell of scandal had called to ask very specific questions. Philip closed his office door. HR opened theirs. Someone suggested that our late-night meetings were unseemly. Someone else suggested that optics mattered as much as outcome. I went to the window and watched the rain run a victory lap. In the meeting that followed, I understood how quickly admiration can be clothed in suspicion. A junior analyst mentioned that my login had accessed sensitive numbers after hours. She said it plainly, as if reading the label on a jar. I felt the shape of the room change, as if the air density had shifted. In my chest, something dropped like a stone into water and waited to hit bottom. I said, evenly, that I often ran analyses after hours, not for secrecy but for the bliss of uninterrupted thought. HR nodded. Philip's jaw tightened, a small movement meant for himself and me. The analyst added that a download had been traced to an off-site IP address at 2:13 a.m., that the activity looked deliberate. I closed my eyes briefly and saw my laptop at home, the way I had left it open on the couch the night before, the glow lighting the living room with the small square of another life. The accusation was both absurd and plausible in the way that frightens reasonable people. I had the access. I had the late hours. The facts marched in formation toward a conclusion that would stain me beyond this building. I thought of the interns who looked at me as if I were an equation to be solved. I thought of my ex-husband and his cautious, gentle explanations, and of my children who had learned to be adults without needing me to solve their mornings. I thought of the slender warmth of an elevator moment and how quickly it could be rewritten as motive. Philip cleared his throat. He said that before we allowed inference to masquerade as evidence, we should gather the rest of the data: server logs, file hashes, a review of recent contractor access. He spoke without raising his voice. He looked at me once, briefly, and held my gaze a fraction of a second longer than decorum allowed. His confidence didn't absolve me. It steadied the room enough that people remembered their own names. HR promised a prompt and thorough review. The meeting migrated back into the day, leaving me sitting with a quiet that had more weight than the hour could bear. He waited until the door clicked and then sat across from me, not the way an executive sits, but the way a person does when the lines on a map have been redrawn and they want to be sure you can still find your way home. I told him what I had done that night, the email drafts, the spreadsheets, the habitual clearing of tabs, the tea I brewed without finishing. I told him I had left the laptop open, then fallen asleep on the couch with a book on my chest like a small animal. He nodded and said we would replicate the timeline precisely. We would ask it to track the data's path like a bloodhound, and in the meantime, we would keep breathing. The rumor grew legs in the hallway. It ran up and down the elevators, sat in on design chairettes it was not invited to. Someone asked me, with a solicitous expression that made me want to laugh, if I was okay. Philip stayed very calm in very public places, and very focused in very private ones. He made it clear that shortcuts would not be tolerated. He moved meetings to rooms with glass walls and left the doors open, the better to lift our work into the light. He was protecting both me and the institution, and I was grateful and angry that I needed protection. At the end of that week, the conference room with the perfect view turned into a theater of poise. The board arrived, scented faintly of cologne and importance, and sat on one side of the table as if they were a jury. Philip asked me to walk them through our procurement safeguards. I did, watching my hands behave as if they belonged to someone not under suspicion. He followed with a quiet presentation of the IT forensics, which had traced the leak to a subcontractor's temporary license, issued, ironically, under the insistence of one of the same board members for the sake of efficiency. It turned out a senior assistant at the subcontractor had forwarded a spreadsheet to a personal email account, innocent, she said, for the convenience of working at home. And the spreadsheet had been glimpsed by someone who loved money more than sleep. The chain of custody was as plain as fingerprints in dust. My name fell away from the narrative, as if a headline had been edited, and the room shifted back to its ordinary climate. There were apologies. There are always apologies at that point in the story, and they never arrive with enough humility to satisfy, but they are serviceable. The board member who had insisted on the temporary license looked past me when he shook my hand. HR offered a conversation to check in on my feelings, then suggested a training that would have been funny if it hadn't been insulting. I declined politely because some battles are better fought by reclaiming your time. Afterward, he and I didn't go to the bar everyone else went to. We went to the corner room with the long window and watched the city for a while without speaking, as if words would scuff the floor. Rain had moved on. The streets were glossy, the sky a bruised blue. He stood close but not touching, his presence like a coat draped on my shoulders. He said softly that if I wanted to put any distance between us, for optics, for self-preservation, he would understand. He would be sorry, he admitted, but he would understand. The selflessness in that sentence struck me harder than the rumors had. It made something in me, something I had kept in reserve for years, step forward. I told him the truth I hadn't told anyone in a long time, that I had loved a man for 3 decades without disliking him, and we had still lost each other. That I had built a life again in squares. A bed that stayed made, a stack of bowls that never dwindled, a calendar that clicked forward without needing negotiation. I said I had sworn off the whole shivering electric business of feeling too much, because it had seemed then like a luxury I could no longer justify. "And now?" he asked, not quite a whisper. "Now," I said, and felt my heartbeat count out the words for me. "I would rather be fragile and alive than flawless and alone." He stepped closer, offering the choice back to me with his eyes. I reached up, put my fingertips against the linen at his shoulder, felt warmth answer warmth. He lowered his forehead to mine, that tender prelude that adults discover when they rediscover themselves. The night seemed to gather around the moment, respectful. There were no declarations, no risky promises. There was breath, a shared stillness, the unvarnished relief of being seen and choosing not to look away. When intimacy happened, it didn't announce itself. It threaded itself through the spaces where we already existed together. Late evenings reviewing change orders, mornings with too strong coffee and private jokes we were careful not to let out of our faces. An elevator ride that didn't stop this time, but seemed to linger at each floor just long enough for us to notice our hands almost touching. The first time we crossed the last inch between us, it was in that same corner room, after a long day had softened into night. The city was a quilt of light. His voice had dropped, roughened by restraint. The space between us was smaller than a heartbeat. I knew what would happen if either of us moved, and I moved anyway. The night faded around us, leaving only breath and promise. We did not become reckless. We became very precise. We kept meetings with doors open, kept our laughter quiet, kept our phones face down when we sat together in public places. He overcorrected a little in boardrooms, calling on others before he called on me, and I overcorrected by disagreeing with him in places where agreement would have been more efficient. We made professional space between us like an alley in an old neighborhood, narrow enough to pass a message down, wide enough to pretend nothing was happening in the kitchen beyond. HR saw our caution and sent out a company-wide reminder about relationships and disclosures. We met the policy honestly. It surprised me, the relief in not making an institution our secret enemy. The forms were unromantic, the conversation with legal discreet and brisk. Once the necessary frameworks were in place, the drama shrank to something manageable, like a shadow at noon. Not everyone approved. People who have never been surprised by their own hearts dislike it when others are. The young project manager who had tilted her head at me earlier tilted it again, then a little farther, as if she might find her desired narrative by changing the angle. I let her have her version. It took nothing from the one we were living, the one that involved grocery lists that included 2 sets of preferences and a borrowed sweater in the back seat of a car. It involved his son's text, "You seem happier, Dad," and my daughter's phone call, "Are you seeing someone? I can hear it in your voice." It involved Sundays spent not working, which felt at first like negligence and then like obedience to a new law. The municipal complex advanced. The plaza's paving stones chose their pattern like a melody. The library's windows learned to hold the sky without glare. The same board member who had given me a pointed apology stood in the half-finished atrium and allowed himself to feel proud. You could tell by the way he breathed. At the topping out ceremony, a crane lifted a final beam into place while people clapped with relief disguised as admiration. Philip stood near me, not touching, while jazz played somewhere distant from a tinny speaker and the city performed itself in afternoon light. He leaned in an inch and said he was considering learning to make a different soup. I said I could teach him, then corrected myself cheerfully. We could learn together and ruin the first batch with too much salt and call it dinner anyway. He smiled, and that smile felt like a room with windows on 3 sides. Months passed the way they pass when you are both very busy and very aware of time's tenderness. We traveled for the project when we needed to, kept hotel doors propped open with room service menus until the hallways emptied, and then we closed them like reasonable adults who had decided not to rewrite their own story as a cautionary tale. We learned each other's silences. We negotiated the small things with a care that suggested we were mindful of the large ones we were not saying. We were rarely careless and never ashamed. The resolution to the rumor fell into place with less drama than it deserved. The subcontractor made amends. Legal processes moved at the speed of paper. The junior analyst learned what a correlation was not. I kept my job, my reputation intact, my work the same work it had always been, only now performed in the company of someone who waited for me in the mirror in the morning with a gentleness I had not known I needed. One evening in early spring, the city shook the rain from its shoulders and decided to be kind. The office emptied out in stages, laughing in elevators, coats over arms, the slow dimming of floor after floor. I lingered with one last budget tally, one last email written and reconsidered and rescued from itself. The light over my desk was softer than usual, and I had the peculiar sensation that comes when you forget your own age and remember it again. I stood up, stretched, and crossed to the window. Below, the plaza stones formed their new geometry. Across the way, the library's glass had been cleaned to a shine that made the sky seem more present inside than above. I could see a few people already drifting through the unfinished space. Workers, planners, someone with a clipboard and a sense of ownership. In the reflection, Philip appeared behind me with the same quiet that had felt like a new language the first time he used it. He didn't need to ask if I was ready to go. He set a hand lightly between my shoulders in that old courteous way, and I leaned back half a degree, enough to tell him that the message had been received and welcomed. We didn't make any formal declarations. We made plans, small ones, ordinary in their ambition. We would stop by the corner market and buy herbs with names that sounded like promises. We would eat at my place because his had a set of knives that knew only one use and my cutting board carried a faint history of dinners that fed more than hunger. We would listen to jazz in the kitchen and not talk much. We would be together in the way people our age understand, present not as a performance but as a practice. In the weeks that followed, the office learned to wrap itself around our quiet. He remained my boss in the ways that mattered to the firm, and not my boss in the ways that mattered to us. We had disagreements about how hard to push a client and when to accept a compromise that protected a schedule. In those disagreements, he gave ground to me more often than he would have to another, which I noticed and countered by conceding points more quickly than I otherwise might have, which he noticed and countered with a private smile. Our equilibrium was built like a good building, on decisions layered one on top of another, anchored by an unshowy foundation. Sometimes late, when the building had learned the geometry of evening and the city had traded glare for glow, we took the long way to the elevator, past the materials library where samples lay like polished arguments, past the conference room where the glass now reflected a world that felt less like a stage. He would pause to look at the models, the facades, the scaled people caught forever mid-conversation, and I would love him a little more for the way he loved the beholden parts of our work, the ductwork, the load-bearing, the calculations that made grace possible without needing to speak it into being. On a night like that, when the rain didn't come and the air smelled like a chance taken, we stood again at the window. Below us, a man walked across the plaza with a child whose jump rope slapped the stone like a heartbeat. We watched them go. We didn't say anything profound. He reached for my hand, and I let him have it, and the simple pressure of fingers intertwined felt like a contract we had both read carefully and signed without doubt. The office lights dimmed, one by one, in a sequence we knew by heart now. Design's corner first, then operations, then the corridor near finance that always left one lamp on longer than it needed to. The hum of the elevator smoothed out into a steady promise. Somewhere far below, a car radio drifted up with a measure of jazz, a saxophone attentive to the spaces between notes. We stood together until the window held our shared reflection more firmly than the city's lights beyond it. I had sworn I would never feel this again. I had promised myself safety and found instead a better kind of courage. It did not come with fireworks or declarations. It came with the consistent warmth of another person's presence and the steady belief that out of closeness you could build a life that faced outward. It came in the hand at the small of my back when we moved through doors together, and in the knowledge that if one of those doors led to something difficult, we would choose to walk through anyway. Months later, when the municipal complex opened with speeches and a ribbon that tried to be more symbolic than it needed to be, we stood apart on the plaza so that optics could nod and settle down. A little boy ran through the fountain jets that rose from the stone like laughter. A woman in a red coat stood still and tilted her face to the morning as if testing the air for stories. We watched the crowd discover what we had made space for. He lifted his chin slightly toward the library's long glass, as if to say, "Look." I looked. I saw not just a building but a promise kept, a design that chose welcome over spectacle. I felt his gaze on me like sunlight. I did not look at him. I let the warmth reach me, and I let it stay. We went back to work. We sent emails and reviewed change orders and argued cheerfully about whether the subtle line at the east entrance would read as invitation or barrier. Outside, rain learned to be part of the plaza's life, not its antagonist. Inside, jazz sometimes threaded itself into the air from someone's desk speaker with volume kept polite. People who did not know us well assumed that we had always been the way we were now. People who did knew it had been a choice every day. On a late evening, after most of the city had shuttered its storefronts and the building had settled on its haunches like a cat, I turned off the light in my office and walked into the corridor. He was waiting at the end of it, leaning with one shoulder against the wall, not for effect, but because he had gotten used to using the building itself as a comfortable friend. I walked toward him, and our steps made that soft carpet sound that always feels like closing a door on the day. When I reached him, he didn't say anything. He took my hand. We walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. We listened to the hum that promised motion. The doors opened. We stepped in. The elevator sighed and then began its gentle descent. We stood close, as two people do when space is offered and accepted, and the city slid past our periphery, lights becoming lines, lines becoming memory. If there was gossip, it had softened into the background like the hum of any well-run machine. If there was risk, it had been measured, accounted for, and set aside in favor of something older than caution: trust. At the lobby, we stepped out into the slight cool breath of night. The rain had taken a break. Air moved through the revolving doors with the confidence of a choice made. We crossed the marble, our footsteps paired without effort, and the city opened itself before us like a page. Buildings we knew, streets we would learn again now that we had someone to turn to and say, "Do you see that?" He lifted my hand to his lips, not a spectacle, just a thank you. I felt the steady certainty of that small gesture in a place inside me that had been quiet for years. We walked out together, into the pulse of traffic and the whisper of tires on wet streets, into the music someone's open window allowed to spill, into the late-night skyline that knew our names and repeated them back to us like blessing. And if the office lights dimmed one by one behind us, their glow still lingered, the way a shadow does when you move and find it keeps step with you, assurance more than echo. The shape of what you have built standing with you as you go.